evening and welcome. As I've been saying for the last almost 11 months, I'm Jim Ruane, very proud mayor of the wonderful city of San Bruno. Thank you again for attending this evening. This is a meeting in our efforts again to keep you informed. It'll be similar to the other forms of meetings we've had in the past, with questions being submitted and answers hopefully being provided. But it's a little different in that this is topic specific. Tonight we're not going to get into 1099s, the IRS, PG&E, some of the other things. Tonight we're going to talk to you about and give pretty much an overview of what to expect and also what you would like to see going forward in the Glenview neighborhood. We're talking about all of these sewer pipe restoration, all the wonderful things like water underground, all the gas lines, street lighting. There's lots and lots of work we have yet to do, but in our efforts to do everything as right as we can for you and for the city, we want to keep you informed and get your ideas on all of those items. So we encourage questions, but please try to keep them only to this specific item tonight. As I said, we're going to talk about the infrastructure, and I would like to introduce our city manager, Connie Jackson, who will in fact give you a little more information on things like street closures and pole closings, and then she'll introduce the consultants we have hired to take this on. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you all for coming out once again to engage with us and let us know where you are in terms of your thoughts about rebuilding the neighborhood. We're actually very excited to be here tonight, as the mayor said, to be talking about specific project information and actually beginning to see some rebuilding and planning for the rebuilding of the infrastructure in your neighborhood. So thank you all for being here, and we look forward to sharing information and hearing from you. What I thought you might be interested in right at the top, and I saved you the trouble of asking the question, is I wanted to let you know, first of all, about what you can expect in terms of the timeline and the process for closing the hole and reopening the street, the Glenview Drive, and actually eliminating the private security that's been up in your neighborhood now for the last many months. That work will proceed over the next couple of weeks. First, with closing the hole. There is a fair amount of work that needs to be done to, although the pipe is going to be abandoned and will not be used, as you know, in perpetuity, it is necessary to do some work around the rupture site in order to compact the soil and to secure the pipe, after which the hole will be filled and at least a preliminary layer of paving will be put down so the road can be traveled. We expect that work, as I said, to start within the next couple of weeks. We are currently working with PG&E as our agent in this case to do that work. And we expect that once the hole is closed and we're able to put some initial basic safety improvements in place to secure the canyon area and to make sure, as I said, the road and the sidewalks are at least passable, not finished, but at least people can traverse them safely. We should be in a position to reopen the road and the sidewalk area to pedestrian and vehicle traffic by the beginning of September. Now, I'm not going to tell you precisely when, because I don't know yet, but what I wanted you to know is that we are now finally actively moving towards a scheduled opportunity to get that road reopened and allow you to get from your homes up to Lennard's and to San Bruno Avenue without having to go work around the entire neighborhood. There are two other projects that you can expect to see PG&E in the neighborhood doing over the next, actually, very short period of time, actually beginning tomorrow. to accommodate the building of the subdivision. The old line was abandoned in place, and it lays under Glenview Drive in a parallel location to the current alignment of line 132. As I said, the CPUC has asked PG&E to excavate in order to locate that abandoned pipe in order that they can dig up a section of it and allow for the CPUC to perform some investigation as part of the continuing investigation that they are performing. That work will begin tomorrow, and I believe that will occur over the next 2 days, and potentially, depending on really how long it takes in order to locate and extract the pipe, it could take into the beginning of next week. That work will be occurring right in the Glenview-Earl vicinity inside of the restricted area. The second, an additional project, a third project that you will see PG&E in the neighborhood probably within the next couple of weeks will be to actually complete the work that's necessary to fully and finally and formally abandon that section of line 132, which, as you obviously know, was a commitment early on following the explosion by PG&E. In order to abandon the line, it turns out nothing is really simple, and in order to abandon the line, it is necessary for PG&E to excavate at certain locations, roughly every 1,000 feet along the section that's to be abandoned, and to perform various activities in the vicinity, in the pipe itself. I have it all detailed here, but I'm not sure you're all interested in the exacting details. I'd be happy to discuss it with you further. Suffice it to say that there will be additional excavation work along the actual alignment of line 132. That will occur. That work has not yet been permitted. And let me back up and say, first of all, that anything and everything that PG&E is doing in the neighborhood, and for that matter throughout the city, is subject to their obtaining an encroachment permit from the city of San Bruno. And as part of that process, we use a very thorough and detailed review of what the work is, why it's necessary, when it's going to be performed, and any issues that we foresee within the neighborhood and with city policies and practices. So there is a detailed review that occurs before the project is implemented, and typically that part of the requirement is a specific notice by PG&E to the neighborhood. Some of you, well, I hope all of you, or at least most of you, should have received a telephone call from PG&E about the work that will begin tomorrow morning. The telephone call was necessary because the mailed notice only went into the mail today, so you should be receiving that tomorrow or Friday, but of course the work will already be underway by that time. So on this last project, we expect that work will begin shortly. You will receive notice about that as well, and we expect that work will take approximately 2 to 3 weeks. So again, there will be a fairly significant presence of PG&E crews in the neighborhood over the next month, doing work that, in my opinion anyway, is necessary and important to the rebuilding of the neighborhood. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about those specific activities or to talk to you separately about any details that you might be interested in. Yes, sir. It's going to be abandoned in place, and it involves digging up sections of the pipe in order that any residue in the line, any liquids that may have accumulated, are evacuated.
The ends are capped, and cement foam is injected into the pipeline section. Is that correct? Okay. So there's a fair amount of work that goes into being able to say, okay, the pipe is never going to be used again, but no, they're not going to dig it up and take it away. That actually would be a great deal more disruptive, both to the system as well as to your neighborhood. Okay, thank you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Harry Burrows. Harry is, as the mayor indicated, a consultant to the city who is performing and will be on board with the city for probably the next 18 months, as he'll explain to you, doing the critical work to manage the project of rebuilding all of the infrastructure in your neighborhood, as he's going to discuss with you tonight. So without further ado, we'll have Harry come and take over.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Connie. Yeah, again, my name's Harry Burrows, and like Connie said, I was hired by the city as the project manager to assist in the design and the construction of the infrastructure to be rebuilt in the Glenview neighborhood. Also with us here tonight are our design engineers, BKF engineers, as well as one of their subconsultants, MIG. They will be doing the detailed design work for the project. What I wanted to do was, again, just reiterate one thing, that the purpose of tonight's meeting is to really just focus on the infrastructure aspects of the project. I know there's a whole lot of other questions and concerns that people may have, but really tonight we want to just focus on the infrastructure. In terms of the meeting logistics, I'm going to give hopefully about 10 or 15 minutes of presentation on the basic infrastructure and then open it up to some questions and answers. Then I'll go into another discussion for about 10 or 15 minutes related to some of the streetscape and neighborhood improvements, and again open it up to questions and comments at that point. And I believe that everyone has the opportunity to fill out one of those red or pink cards if they have questions alternately, and it's highly encouraged if people want to ask questions directly. We've got 2 roving microphones that we can give to folks and they can ask their questions. The other thing is we're going to be presenting some information here tonight that's somewhat conceptual in nature. We put a lot of thought into how we want to phase the infrastructure, but we're still working out the logistics and the details. So a lot of your questions, and we welcome all questions, but a lot of your questions we may not have the specific answers to, but we will take that input and come back to you later with hopefully answers to your questions. So again, just to review, the purpose of the meeting is really to inform you guys on the extent of the rebuilding efforts, seek input from the community, and answer questions and hopefully provide some comments. In terms of the reconstruction of the infrastructure, what's really driving it, obviously, is a need to get the infrastructure that's destroyed rebuilt. In addition, though, it's the occupancy of the structures, occupancy of the new residents that are getting rebuilt. There's certain infrastructure that needs to be in place, i.e. gas service to the residents, water service to the residents, before occupancies of these new buildings, new houses can be done. Right now, we've got, I believe, 6 building permits that have been pulled, and there's an additional 5 that are pending. The first occupancies are scheduled for probably sometime late this year, early beginning of next year. The infrastructure out there, as you are well aware, was built in the late 50s. So we've got challenges of aging infrastructure out there. Some of the water lines are old. The sewer lines have infiltration and inflow issues, so we want to take the opportunity with this project and rebuild some of that infrastructure as needed. Unfortunately, when we are talking about rebuilding infrastructure, there's some long-term benefits of having new sewer lines, new water lines, et cetera. but there are going to be some temporary disruptions. The streets will be torn up to construct the new facilities for a period of time. We're looking at phasing the improvements, and as Connie said, it may be up to 18 months that periodically we have different phases of the project under construction. I wanted to talk a little bit about the framework that we're using for evaluating the infrastructure rebuilding. And it really boils down to 4 basic components. One is what I'll refer to as code compliance or new code requirements. The houses that are getting rebuilt, for example, the building codes have changed greatly since the late 50s when those houses were constructed. Just as one example, the new building code requires that the houses be sprinklered. So that certainly wasn't something that was a requirement back in the 50s. And what that means, certain water flows have to be analyzed to make sure that the buildings are adequately sprinklered. The next is what I would call best practices, and that's best practices involved in terms of engineering or green building concepts. The third is we've got the opportunity now to rectify some previous problems, whether it's upsizing some utilities. We've got some, in one particular instance, a sewer line that is a pinch point, for lack of a better way of describing it. It's a smaller diameter sewer line than the ones entering and leaving it, so we got the opportunity now to upsize that line. And then we also want to look at consistency across the neighborhood. If we're doing improvements in one portion of the neighborhood, we don't want to have the entire neighborhood be lagging or inconsistent with those improvements. And one example might be if we do decide to upgrade and change some of the street lights, we don't want to have different looking or different street light standards in one area that aren't consistent throughout the remainder of the neighborhood. As we look at the improvements and all the different pieces that need to come together, it's really a juggling act, and this is a somewhat simplified, believe it or not, process diagram showing all the different pieces that we're looking at that need to come together as part of the infrastructure rebuilding. We've, as I said, done some analysis, and we've identified what we think makes the most sense right now in terms of the phasing of the infrastructure, and I just want to touch on them real briefly here. One of the first things that needs to be done is PG&E has a project that they're proposing to go out and replace the old dual pipe system of gas service lines to the individual houses. What's out there in most of the neighborhood is a pipe down each side of the street, smaller diameter, and off of that comes the individual services to your houses. In the immediate area of the fire, those pipes have been damaged and or going to be phased out. So PG&E desires to get in there and replace those with one single pipe that goes down pretty much the middle of the street and have services come directly off of those to both sides of the street to the individual houses. That work will probably be done here in September, October timeframe. The next is what we call phase 1, or we've also called them, and you'll see here in the presentation, safety improvements. And what the phase 1 improvements are is, as Connie mentioned earlier, the crater's going to get filled, and then there's a desire to open up the roadways to pedestrian and vehicular traffic as soon as possible. And so there's certain improvements that need to occur that will make that area safe to drive and to walk, and I'll get into those in a little bit more detail. Phase 2 improvements are improvements that are in the immediate area of the rebuilding. And then phase 3 are improvements that are more neighborhood-wide. And then the last is phase 4, which is a reconstruction of the park. And I noticed that some of you were looking at this drawing on the board over here before the meeting. What, in a nutshell, it is just a recap of what I just said. The red area is the immediate safety improvements along the canyon and along the roadways. The blue areas represent the phase 2. The pink area or reddish area represents the phase 3, and the green area is the park reconstruction. So just quickly to recap what I said regarding the PG&E gas distribution reconstruction, this is roughly the area that we're talking about, and again, it's the single pipeline that will replace the old dual system. And PG&E has already prepared plans on that. We've reviewed them. Our civil engineer has reviewed them for consistency related to where they fall within the roadway relative to the other utilities, and so we're getting our comments back to PG&E, and like I said, their desire is to have that construction done in the September-October timeframe. In terms of the Phase 1 improvements, the immediate safety improvements, and again, those are the ones that we want to do to open the roadway up to make it safe for pedestrians and vehicles. What is planned here is a repair of the roadway and the sidewalks where they're damaged so that they're safe to walk on and drive on. We're also looking at security related to the canyon and security of the individual lots that haven't started the reconstruction yet. And here's some thoughts that we have, at least initially, related to this. The yellow there represents the barricades that are currently out there. And when those come down, the roads will be opened, and as Connie mentioned, the security, 24-hour security will be gone. The red represents where we think it makes the most sense to put the temporary chain link fence that is out there now. It's not there in some of those locations. For example, these areas here aren't fenced because they're barricaded off. So we'd be looking at putting additional temporary chain link fence similar to what is out there in some of these other areas along the front of those lots. And then what we're contemplating, at least now, is some sort of fencing along the canyon to secure it. And one of the concerns is that once this area is open to traffic, we want to discourage looky-loos and other folks coming up there as much as possible, discourage people from walking into the canyon. So the current thinking is that we would put a chain link fence along where this blue line is to secure the canyon, and that will most likely be a temporary solution. Obviously, long-term, we don't want to have a chain link fence there, especially in light of rebuilding the park, but it's a good temporary solution. And one of the things that we welcome tonight is any questions or comments related to that idea. And again, that's just to illustrate the chain link fence. There is a access road here that has been constructed to some sanitary sewer manholes, so we would put a locking gate there to allow maintenance crews in that area. And then this is just a real quick detail showing the thoughts on where we would move the fence to that's in front of the individual lots along the street. Currently, what's out there is this fence sort of is right at the back of sidewalk, or in some instances lays across the sidewalk. We'd like to move that back to essentially the property line, repair the sidewalk so that it's safe for pedestrians. Okay, so phase 2 is the improvements in what we call the rebuilding area. And that's, again, essentially this area here in blue, which is the immediate area that was heavily damaged by the fire. And in this portion of the project, what we're looking at doing is replacing the underground utilities, the water line, the sewer line, and in many instances, there's some storm drainage improvements that need to be done or can be done. We've got some areas of local ponding. We've got some old valley gutters out there and some inlets that don't really drain to anywhere. Now's the opportunity for us to go in there and fix those drainage issues that we're having. And like I said before, also the opportunity to get in there and do curb and gutter and the sidewalk repairs. Then phase 3 is essentially the remainder of the neighborhood, and that's this area represented in pink. And our current thoughts are to go in there and do a replacement and upsizing of the water line throughout the remainder of the neighborhood, replacing the sewer, and again, that's the sewer that experiences a lot of infiltration and inflow. Once we have the streets torn up, it makes sense to go in there and reconstruct the street as well, so do the street resurfacing. And where applicable, repair and replace the curb and gutter and sidewalks, and we're contemplating, what makes sense from a sidewalk standpoint throughout the remainder of the neighborhood. The entire sidewalks throughout the neighborhood, curb returns, so that's something we're still evaluating. And then the last is to touch briefly on the park reconstruction. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time here tonight, except to say that there will be a whole separate process and timeline regarding the reconstruction of the park. It'll be a public process. The public's input is highly encouraged. And, again, I don't want to go into too much detail here tonight on that because I think that's going to take another public meeting and another public process. This, and I apologize, it's not real legible in this presentation, but this is just an overview of the schedule. Again, we're looking at the phase one, the safety improvements that were shown in red, and that's the fencing around the canyon and some of the other temporary sidewalk improvements. Having that occur, sometime during August, maybe stretching into early September, but that needs to occur before we get the roadway open for pedestrians and traffic. And sort of concurrent with that, maybe lagging a little bit, will be the PG&E residential gas service reconstruction. The phase two improvements, which are the improvements in the rebuilding area, those improvements we'd like to do this fall. We're still struggling a little bit with that timing because that is the rainy season. We have certain improvements that need to get done prior to the occupancies of homes. On the other hand, we've got to juggle the rainy season and what makes the most sense in terms of having the roadways torn up during rainy season. And on top of all of that, we have the coordination with the contractors who are doing the rebuilding of the homes. So it is a fairly logistical challenge that we have in rebuilding this infrastructure. And then the phase three is the area-wide improvements in the remainder of the neighborhood. Those, we have the time to design those improvements now. So our target is that during next year's construction season, April to October, those improvements would be done. And then lastly is the park reconstruction, and that I've put last, but depending on how that process goes, that could get moved forward as well. So with that, I'd like to pause because I know that's a lot of information in a short period of time, and ask the audience to give us questions.
Our home is supposed to be done by the end of October, November. So you're telling me that because they won't be doing the utilities till later on, we can't occupy our property. Am I correct?
No, that's not totally correct. What the critical path item for you is probably the gas reconstruction. There is water and sewer within the roadway. So in instances where we haven't replaced the water or sewer, your house can still connect to the existing lines. And when we go in and do the replacement, we'll hook you up to the new lines.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I just have a question about any power lines. Are there plans to put those underground?
Well, you know what? That is something that I'm going to touch on briefly in the next part of the presentation, if you can wait. Okay.
Yeah, I was just curious, why are you waiting so long to get this project underway when summer is almost over and the rainy season is knocking at our door already? You're going to open the streets up, and we're in a high slide area in some of these areas. And, if you open up the street and don't get it closed up in time, you're going to have a whole new set of problems.
No, that's an excellent point. I think, unfortunately, it takes time to design things and time to plan things. And like I said, we've got a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that need to come together. And we want to make sure that we do it correctly and not hurry into something and then end up with, a problem or issue that, is untenable. So we want to, obviously, speed is of the essence, time is of the essence, but on the other hand, we want to make sure that we do it as thoughtful and as correct as possible. So, and we know the rainy season is a big concern.
You said they're going to replace the gas line down the middle of the street to connect to the home. Is that
We have been told by PG&E that it is not. I would probably defer that question to PG&E. I don't know if there's a representative here this evening from PG&E that can answer that, but like I said, the initial indications has been no, but we can certainly get more information on that for you.
Hi, Harry. Harry came out to my house the other day with a couple of geophysicists, and I had pointed out some water issues on Earl Avenue closest to the epicenter of the explosion. And from talking to different neighbors, that same water issue goes on the other side of Earl up the street. And I just wondered if you happened to find out with checking the plateau area if there is any resolution, or I know that you mentioned you're going to take care of those the easements that are on the concrete easements behind the hill on my property all the way up the street. So I just was also pointing this out to encourage people to come forward to talk to him if you are having water issues, because there are a lot of water issues in the surrounding homes to the explosion site. So I just wondered if you had any time yet to evaluate that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up, Denise. What Denise is referring to is that she has raised some concerns, and some other residents have raised some concerns about some additional groundwater that they have seen in the last year in their yards and in their subdrains. And as Denise indicated, we have gotten our geotechnical engineer, the same geotechnical engineer who did the canyon slope stability work. So they're very familiar with the area. We've gotten them out there, and they're starting an investigation now. And so, again, it's very, very early in the process, but we are taking that very seriously, and we will look into it.
I also just want to compliment him because he came out right away as soon as he was told about the issue, because I've been talking to the city about it for a long time, and I just wanted to thank you for doing that.
Any other questions?
I live on Estates Drive, which is just south of the explosion site off of Glenview. And my question was, are we not a part of the Phase 3 neighborhood-wide improvements?
Yes, you are. If the graphic does not show it, that was just an oversight. So I apologize, but yes, you are part of the Phase 3 improvements.
Okay, thank you.
With respect to the previous question about water and drainage, there's a concrete culvert that runs behind the properties on the 1600 side of Claremont. Is that part of your study as well? Are you doing anything with that, or is there any plan for doing any work there?
I'm not familiar with the culvert that runs behind there, so I apologize. I think one of the things that Denise was referring to was up on the top of some of the slopes on Earl, on her side of the street, which would be the south side of the street, that there is a V-ditch, an intermediate V-ditch that may over the years have gotten plugged with silt, and that that is something that probably needs to get cleaned out at some point. But I'm not familiar with the culvert you're referring
yeah,
to.
the properties that are just above the canyon, 1660, 16.
Oh, okay.
Right there. It's interesting because kind of right where the new retaining wall stops, this ditch runs along the top of these properties right before it goes down into the canyon. So that's the piece that I'm talking about. And then my next question is, are there going to be some erosion control measures that will be taken by the city before the rain starts, while construction's going on these properties at that same block that I'm talking about above the canyon?
Well, I think certainly in terms of the canyon, yes, the city's monitoring that very closely with this geotech that I described earlier. And so whatever measures are needed before the rainy season, I think those will certainly get put into place.
Okay, sorry, I have one last question.
Sure.
Do you envision that there may be some times during the infrastructure work where you might not allow projects to start construction, in other words, new homes?
You know, that may be a possibility. It's something that we certainly want to avoid, if at all possible. But you know, like I said, it is a big logistical puzzle that we're going to have to work out, and you know, we want to make sure that that doesn't occur if at all possible.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, one.
Thank you. I was just asking, what entity is going to be picking up all of this reconstruction project? Is PG&E ultimately going to have to pick it up, or the city assuming all of these costs, or?
You know, that's something that's probably above my pay grade, and I think maybe Connie or someone else would be more appropriate to answer that question.
Okay.
Yeah. And while we're waiting on Connie, why don't I read a couple of the questions that are on the comment cards here. When are the trees to be planted in the canyon? When is Glenview going to be accessible? Why is it taking so long for my neighbors to rebuild? When are trees going to be replanted in the canyon? We're discussing that now. We've had discussions with the geotech. We've still got to close the loop on some of those discussions. Ideally, we'd like to get the tree replanting in the canyon done before this next rainy season. So that's what we're targeting. When is Glenview going to be accessible? I think we've addressed that earlier. We're planning, I think Connie indicated that the crater is going to be filled here shortly, and we'd like to get that open. The target is early September. And then why is it taking so long for my neighbors to rebuild? I think that's, you know, that's on an individual case-by-case basis. I think some residents are still deciding whether they are going to rebuild. Some are deciding, you know, do they want to rebuild the exact same house? They're going through the design process. I think it's just such an individual issue that, you know, it just takes people differing amounts of time. Connie, the question? Okay.
I wanted to just add to what Harry just said about individuals rebuilding. Actually, I think many of you know that the city put an expedited planning and building permit review process in place within the first few weeks after the incident. And that system is still in place and actually is working quite well. Our Community Development Director, Aaron Acton, is here tonight. If you have any specific questions for him about how that works or how long it takes. What I know is that folks are actually getting through the process pretty darn quickly compared to what it normally takes for a new single-family house to be rebuilt. Unfortunately, it is, just by its nature, a fairly long process. The part that we're responsible for is being done fairly quickly, and then, as I'm sure many of you can appreciate, families who've been affected by this incident are at all different stages in their decision-making and their own personal timelines and ability to move forward. So we're doing what we can to assist everybody with doing whatever it is that they believe is the right thing for them to do. So first I'll answer the question, then I have another list of questions here that I'll take a moment to answer. Who's paying for the infrastructure repairs and improvements? And that's actually, as many of these questions are, is not a completely simple answer. There are three basic funding sources that the city has accessed and will continue to access in order to put the neighborhood back together and to do everything that we need to do to provide service to you and your neighbors. The first is the state disaster reimbursement process and funding. There are very specific rules that apply and a very specific analysis to what exactly is covered through that process, and generally it is very precisely evaluated damage that occurred as a direct and immediate result of the disaster. And there's, as I said, a complicated review process that attaches to that. The second funding source is the city's insurance. Most of, just like your homes and your personal property, you purchase insurance. We do the same thing for our infrastructure, and again, subject to very precise, exacting evaluation and rules. Some of the work we expect that was very precisely related to the incident itself may be covered by the city's insurance. Thirdly, and I would expect that the majority, frankly, of the infrastructure repairs and improvements that we're talking about tonight will most likely be funded by funds that have been made available by PG&E to the city for strictly and under a series of rules. In other words, that's been made available to the city by PG&E, subject to a series of rules that include things like not reimbursed from some other source and not insured. So costs that are not insured and otherwise reimbursed will most likely be covered by funds that have been made available through PG&E to the city. Those funds are only available for the costs associated with city services and infrastructure rebuilding. I have a series of questions here that I'll take this opportunity to answer. Automated shutoff valves, will PG&E provide? And let me go through because I have one answer for several of these questions. Accurate documents and records of new PG&E pipes. Will PG&E give us records for San Bruno? And then who pays for all of this new work? Does PG&E fund it? So I answered the first part of new work that's being done by the city. Yes, I expect ultimately that costs will go back to PG&E. PG&E will certainly fund any costs associated with infrastructure improvements to their system, new shutoff valves, for example. We don't know at this point whether PG&E has committed, as I understand it, to review issues associated with new shutoff valves. It's likely that those issues will also be evaluated through the CPUC rulemaking process that is currently going on. But at this point, I don't know, and I don't believe information is currently available about whether, when, or how many shutoff valves might ultimately be installed. That's an issue that continues, obviously, to be on your radar screen as well as ours, as well as communities up and down the state who are watching this situation in our community. Same answer having to do with documents and records. PG&E obviously has been under heavy scrutiny by the public and by the media related to their documentation and record keeping, and that's not an issue that the city is directly involved with. Lastly, if the explosion area is closed, in other words, if the hole is closed, has the final NTSB report been completed? Actually, those are at this point two somewhat separate issues. We understand that the NTSB is actively and probably furiously at this point engaged in completing their final report. The NTSB has not set a date for their meeting at which they will receive and act on the final report, although it has been their intent to do so before the first anniversary of the incident. And we're still expecting that that is highly likely. So that means that the report itself, because it needs to be in the board members' hands well before their board meeting, we expect that the NTSB is very actively now engaged in putting the final report together, and probably very soon we'll have that completed. The NTSB process, though, does not make that report public until the board meeting. So we will not know, we will not have it, and you will not have it, and we won't know what it says until the board meets and the report is finally released to the public. All of that said, the NTSB has used a very detailed and methodical process for their investigation over these past many months, and has at various times said that they no longer needed access to the explosion site, and then come up with a new piece of information and decided that they would like to have some more access to the explosion site. That's not the only reason that the hole has remained open. There is also an ongoing investigation being conducted by the CPUC. That investigation is still, I believe, months away from being completed, but the CPUC no longer has need of access to the crater site itself. And then lastly, until all of the investigative activities had been completed, we had held off on allowing access to that hole to insurance companies and attorneys who had contacted us, some of them probably on your behalf, who had contacted us and said, we want to be able to access the hole. And so that has now recently been completed. We've provided access to everybody who asked us, and now we can finally close the hole. Thank you.
Okay, I have a few more questions and a comment here, and I'll quickly go through these and then get on to the next portion of the presentation. Next question is, will the canyon access road be off limits to the public? And I think as I indicated earlier, at least the current intent for the near term would be to fence off the canyon with a security fence, probably chain link, and until such time as we get a little bit more detail of what's going to happen with the park and some of the other things, that's at least the current intent. Next question is, when you repave the streets, will you lower the crown to allow driveway access with no damage to vehicles? As I mentioned earlier, our civil engineers have just started looking at the design. I think one of the issues may be over the years when roads get resurfaced, they get ground at the curb line and they get paved in the middle, so sometimes the center of the road gets higher. If we're doing reconstruction wherever possible, we're going to remedy that situation. Will you repave and replace sidewalks on the 1700 block of Claremont? Again, we're evaluating all the neighborhood, and so that's certainly something that we will look into. Next question, with drainage such an issue, why not inspect all of the drainage ditches? I guess I do want to make one comment. I think immediately after the event, the city did do a detailed video inspection of most all of, if not all of the storm drains that are in the neighborhood. So that has been done. I think that some of the drainage issues we're referring to is there are these V ditches or valley gutters that are behind some lots or within some lots. Those, I think, ultimately are the responsibility of the homeowners for maintenance, and I think over the course of 50 plus years, they have gotten silted in. Certainly, I think that those need to be identified, and where work needs to be done, that should be flagged off. And then the last here is a comment. It says, we are residents of Crestmore 2, not Glenview neighborhood. Would like to see, and I think this says pillars at the 4 entrances of Crestmore 2 designating our neighborhood name. We also suggest undergrounding the electrical. So. Okay, well, if there are some more questions, maybe we can wait and address those at the end. I'd like to, for time reasons, go on to the next portion of the presentation. And that's related to potential community and streetscape improvements. And I think just to preface this, there's been a lot of interest and questions that have been directed to the city and city staff over the course of the last several months to almost a year, related to when this area is rebuilt, what is the possibility of incorporating some streetscape improvements, whether it be enhanced landscaping or other things? What about some traffic calming measures? And for those of you who don't know what traffic calming is, that's the engineer's word or planner's word for slowing traffic down. And other potential, visual aesthetic enhancements as we do the rebuilding. And just to spark some ideas and discussions, we have put some ideas down on paper that I think some of you looked at earlier. I'll show those here in a second. But just real quickly, I think the opportunity exists to incorporate those if it's something that is desired and makes sense. It is something that probably with the rebuilding of the park provides an opportunity to integrate some of those improvements there as well. So we're certainly looking into that, into these possibilities. And here's some examples of some potential improvements. This is showing traffic circles at the Glenview and Claremont intersection, and potentially one down at Earl. And again, these are just ideas on paper. There's nothing that's been designed or nothing that's been more than just something thrown out there for the sake of garnering some discussion. This illustrates what are called curb extensions, and what curb extensions really are just widening out of the curbs at the intersections to provide a necking down at the intersection. It provides an area for additional landscaping, as well as gives that visual perception to the driver that the road does narrow, and so they are to slow down. So it serves a couple different purposes. The next is essentially the same thing, which is curb extensions at the intersections, but carrying that width, an additional width of road all the way down, and having that additional greenway or parkway to plant some trees in. And then the last suggestion has been, what about the possibility of maybe doing a median island out there and incorporating some greenscape and trees into that? And so again, these are just for illustration. We're open to and looking at different ideas. These are just some photo illustrations of some of those concepts. The other thing that's been mentioned, and I think it's been mentioned both by the residents as well as it's a citywide goal, is to look into replacing the streetlight system that's out there. Streetlight system is the old series system, which is like your old Christmas tree lights. When one goes out, all of them go out. And those require a lot of maintenance. The technology has changed over the years. There's new technology that's a lot more energy efficient, that's a lot more reliable, and is lower maintenance. And so we have the opportunity with this project to look into replacing the streetlight system. And not just replacing the system in kind, meaning the light standards or fixtures that are out there, but potentially upgrading and doing some sort of decorative fixtures that might help define the entire neighborhood. So that's just an idea. And then the question that was raised earlier, and it sounds like it was one of the comments, it's again, has been expressed over the past many months by many folks, is what is the potential of undergrounding the overhead utilities that are out there? And we are exploring the feasibility and the viability of doing that. It's not a simple thing to evaluate. There's not just PG&E lines, electrical lines that are on those poles. There's telephone lines and there's cable TV. To undertake a project like this is a large project, large undertaking. It requires essentially new panels to be put on the houses, and the plumbing, for lack of a better way of describing it, out to the street. So within the streets would be new conduits and new structures and substructures. In many instances, the structures might be in the people's front yards where they can't fit within the right-of-way. Obviously, there's huge benefit from a visual standpoint. Those power lines and telephone lines behind your houses can go away in many instances. The downside is that in some areas where there's a public utility easement that these poles are within, there's also these V-ditches, so the public utility easement may not be able to go away. The other thing is from a timing standpoint, because it does entail so much coordination with the various utilities and detail related to the streets, it will probably delay the overall project by maybe a year, maybe 2 years. It's like I said, it is a huge undertaking. So it does have obvious benefits, but some of the detriments are that it is a lengthy time process and it is very expensive. And then the last, again, I touched upon this earlier, is the park rebuilding.
As we've all done, we've been told how much money a lot costs and how much money our insurance will pay. Does that then figure in, and should we not even consider things like this? Is that?
Well, I guess I have a couple comments, and maybe I'll let Connie elaborate on it. But my first comment is we don't really know the extent of the cost yet. We're still evaluating that. We've just started looking into this, really. We've got PG&E has to give us some estimates of what their costs are, and then from an engineering standpoint, we know in terms of, like I said, the plumbing work that goes into the streets, the conduits and the pipes and the structures, the boxes. We can ascertain those costs fairly easily once we have a preliminary, at least preliminary paper design done. So it's really premature right now. I just make the overarching comment from a cost standpoint because, like I said, it is an expensive process, but we're trying to quantify that.
I think that the only thing I can add is that until we know how much it's going to cost and what the real needs are, and the needs include putting the neighborhood back together in an acceptable manner that doesn't just patch up the holes, but reestablishes and recreates a nice, viable neighborhood. That's our objective. And until we really know what it is that you folks need and that it's going to cost, it's a little bit early for us to be able to say exactly how it's going to be paid for. So I understand what you're saying, and I think this isn't an opportunity to do anything that anybody might ever wish for, but it certainly is an opportunity to take the time and the effort to do it right. We don't want, and we don't think you want, to simply slap down some asphalt and put up a street light and say, okay, well, now we're back in business. Our job is to recreate your neighborhood a viable, healthy place to live, and that's our expectation.
Those cleaned out. And I was told that the city over the years has sent letters out in mailings to notify the owners to make sure that they kept those clean. I had asked that that letter be generated to my neighbors on my street when I kind of discovered this issue, and they were supposed to be sent out, but to my knowledge, I don't know that they were sent out. Are we to still be responsible for doing that, or are you guys going to uncover those and redo that whole system in your project?
I think it's difficult to say precisely. There are V-ditches that are on public property that are owned and maintained by the city. There are other V-ditches that are on private property, and it will continue to be the private property owner's responsibility whether those V-ditches currently exist or whether they are newly created on private property. If it's on private property, it's the private property owner's responsibility to maintain it. So as to your question about or your comment about letters being sent out, we do that, I believe, once a year. Clara, is that correct?
those letters are sent out before the rainy season, sometime in September. And would be my assumption that each of you will receive those letters. If you didn't receive last fall, certainly I will make sure that you will receive it this fall.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Then I wanted to talk briefly about communication related to the infrastructure rebuilding on an ongoing basis, and your involvement and input. We are planning on expanding the city's website, the page related to Glenview, and we'll be posting updates to the project there. There'll also be an avenue for the public to pose questions and comments related to the project. So again, we welcome as much public input as you can give us. The other is there's a periodic newsletter that goes out. We'll be keeping the public informed during that of the process within that newsletter as well. We obviously want to hold future community meetings to keep you informed as we proceed along the process of the project. The frequency of those meetings we still haven't worked out that detail on, but again, we want to make sure that they're as frequent as needed to keep the public informed. And then there's always other opportunities, including the San Bruno cable, the community update segments that will have periodic updates as well. And then in terms of next steps, where do we go from here? Again, we appreciate all of the feedback that you've given us tonight, and as I said, and we'll continue to say, we welcome continuing and ongoing feedback. We'll take that feedback, we'll analyze it, incorporate it into the project and the design as much as possible, as appropriate. And we're going to start getting into the design of some of the improvements, and probably when we're in that design process and have some ideas formulated and a little bit more concreteness around some of these concepts, that would be a good time to come back and have another community meeting and show the community what our ideas are at that point in time. And then we talked about construction, and we've got at least 4 phases, maybe 5 phases of construction that we've identified, and so we'll be moving into construction, at least on the early phases, as quickly as possible. And again, we appreciate and thank you in advance for your patience, for the disruptions and delays that we anticipate. Yes, sir.
One last question. You talk about replacing the trees in the canyon. How about the trees on our property that were cut down?
On private property?
For private property that hasn't been addressed in some other manner, either through your insurance or through donations or the process that PG&E set up, we're certainly interested to hear and understand what those issues might be and where we might assist, particularly when we're talking about trees, because as it turns out, we have a number of folks who have, in their generosity and desire to be of help, have an interest in providing and planting trees. So we are actively looking at how we might take advantage of some of those resources to provide some additional streetscape improvements, as well as I'm sure that we can assist you in identifying a source for trees on private property as well. So we're happy to hear from you if there's something we can do. I'm sorry.
If I want to put a tree back up there, do I have to do it by myself? With my own cost?
No, we're happy to work with you. We have a number of resources for, particularly for trees. Interestingly enough, a lot of people like to donate trees, so we're happy to work with you on that.
For the streetscape designs, how are you guys going to Is it a vote? For all the streetscapes, are you going to come up with the design? Is it going to be a vote? Is it going to be just comments? Or are you guys just going to pick one? Just kind of curious.
Well, again, I think we'd like some input from the community. So, if, again, we've hit you fresh with this right now. So if you have any thoughts or ideas, please share them with us through emails or, one of the other avenues. Call us. What we'd like to do is probably develop a couple alternatives that are viable. We probably want to do a little bit of pre-engineering on them and some cost estimating, and then come back with our recommendations of what we think is the most viable from a
Okay. I have one
from
more
that
question.
standpoint.
On the phase 2, when you guys say you're going to redo the streets and the sidewalks, are you going to wait till most of the homes are done because of all the construction vehicles and stuff, or?
Yeah, and I apologize. I sped through that portion of the presentation probably too quickly without making this point, which is when we do those phase 2 improvements, we'll leave that last lift, the last layer of asphalt off. We won't pave it finally. It's going to create some, very minor issues that we'll have to deal with in terms of drainage in the street. But the intent is we don't want to put a brand new roadway surface down and then have, as you say, multiple different contractors out there doing home construction and tearing up our new roads. So, we'll save that final lift of pavement to the end when we do phase 3, and we'll pave, at least the plan is, we'll pave all the streets at one time.
They're going to be doing?
Connie? The question was, due to PG&E's track record, is there any independent company or entity that's going to be overseeing their work?
Will there be an independent company overseeing what work? Which specifically are you talking about?
From starting tomorrow, they're supposed to dig up a pipe. Who knows what they're digging, how they're digging.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Work that is requested or done for somebody else, in our case for us to fill the hole, or for the CPUC to dig up the abandoned 1948 pipe. CPUC will be on site. The city of San Bruno will be on site. There is not, when PG&E is doing normal line connections, connecting up the utility to the home, the new houses, our inspectors are doing normal building inspections, but they're doing their routine activities independently. Work that they're doing for us or for others, we're very interested in. We're on site.
Okay, any other questions? Well, that was really the extent of the presentation for this evening, so we really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. Thank you for your questions and comments, and you'll be hearing from us in the near future through one of the avenues I described. Thank you.